you very much for joining us today to this very special presentation. As you probably know already, today we will be talking about Cuba. We will have two parts. First, we'll have an incredible writer and a great Kesher speaker that we have had the pleasure to invite many times, Ruth Behar. Will be sharing about her book and the connection to the trip to Cuba, which will happen in May next year. And after that, we will have a second part where Project Por Amor, Sage from Project Por Amor, will share with us all the details about the trip. So Ruth, please, the stage is yours.
Got it. Thank you. Am my volume okay? Okay, great. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here with you today. Thank you, Sebastian and Dora from Kesher, and thank you, Sage and Nadine from Project Por Amor. Really, really glad to be here today to talk to all of you and share some thoughts about my book, Letters from Cuba, and this amazing trip that we've organized based on the book. So I have a PowerPoint. Let me get that on right now and we'll get started. Here we go. I think it's okay. Does that look okay, Sebastian? Yeah, okay, great. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the book and a little bit about Cuba. So I was born in Cuba, and I was born in Havana. I came to the United States when I was 5 years old. And I think that experience of being an immigrant child, growing up with Spanish, with English, being Jewish and being Cuban and American, all of those things led me to anthropology, to cultural anthropology, and the desire to understand culture, language, immigration, identity, diaspora. All those things were of deep interest to me. And I studied anthropology, went to live in Spain initially. I'm Sephardic on my father's side, Ashkenazi on my mother's side, did research in a small village in Spain, then went on to do work in Mexico and studied the lives of women in Mexico. And then from there, I got interested in finally in going to Cuba and getting to know the place where I was born and did research in Cuba, initially a Bridges to Cuba project, trying to connect writers and artists and scholars in Cuba and in the diaspora. And from there, I went on to study the Jews of Cuba and wrote a book, An Island Called Home, that I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment. And then I've been very interested in being vulnerable and changing anthropology so that it's not about viewing people at a distance, but rather getting close to people and being vulnerable, hearing what they say, and that in some way affects you emotionally and leads to a heart opening. So that's kind of my background a little bit as an anthropologist. I can tell you more about it later if you're interested. And I also made a documentary about the Sephardic Jews of Cuba called Goodbye, Dear Love, Adio Querida, a number of years ago, dedicated to my father. And then most recently, I've started writing fiction. In the last 10 years, I've been writing fiction, most of it directed towards young people, but I think of this fiction as books that anybody at any age can read. And the first one that I wrote is Lucky Broken Girl, based on my own life as a Cuban Jewish immigrant to New York. The next one, Letters from Cuba, which I'll be talking about today, is based on my maternal grandmother's story. And then I've also written two picture books, Tia Fortuna's New Home, which is a Sephardic story, and Pepita Meets Bebita, which I co-wrote with my son when he became a father and I became a grandmother. So to give you just a little bit of background. And most recently, I have a book called Across So Many Seas, A Través de los Mares. This book is dedicated and inspired by my paternal grandmother, my Sephardic grandmother. So I've also been recently included in a very interesting book, What Jewish Looks Like. I had no idea I was going to be included in this book that's all about the great diversity of Jewish people, and they included me as well here. And you can see that what they found interesting about me was my desire to connect and to continue connecting and reconnecting with Cuba through memory, art, culture, and Jewish spirituality and religion. So that was a really nice surprise. So I was born in Cuba, as I said. I was a little girl when we left, and I spent my early childhood years in Cuba, living in Havana, very near the famous Malecón. If you've heard anything about Havana, you've surely heard about this wonderful seawall that just goes all around the city the edge of the city of Havana, kind of like a necklace. And kids love to walk up on the seawall, as you see me there with my mother, many, many years ago when I was a little girl. And I went to school in Cuba. There was a Jewish day school that my mother had gone to where instruction was in Yiddish and Spanish. And I briefly went there for a few months before we left Cuba in the early 60s. And that uniform that you see there, my mother brought my school uniform with us. So I actually have that incredible treasure. So we lived very near the synagogue, the main synagogue, the Jewish Community Center, we could call it, which and we popularly call it the Patronato. El Patronato, we lived half a block away, so we would always pass by, and there are these pictures of me standing in front of the Patronato synagogue, which has the 12 tribes of Israel on the facade of the building. And when I started traveling back to Cuba in the early 90s, my early desire was just to stand in those same places where I had stood as a child in these pictures that my mother brought out of Cuba. I just wanted to stand in those places and be back to this place that had once belonged to me. And so it started out as very much a spiritual quest going back to Cuba. And then as the years passed, I decided to do an anthropological study, as I mentioned, of the Jewish community in Cuba and traveled all over the island several times, meeting all the Jewish people that I could find, not just in Havana, where most of the community is located, but in the most remote parts of Cuba. And this book came about. So I'll just show you some of the highlights. I was really amazed to find that many people had kept a lot of important symbols of their Jewish identity, even though during the early decades of the revolution they had essentially enforced atheism on the people, but nevertheless people had held on to a talit, a kippah that had belonged, in this case, to a Turkish Sephardic grandfather. Others had passports that belonged to relatives, in this case belonging to a mother and a sister, a Polish passport in this case. And in this case, Ida, who we see here, still was holding on to the uniform that her father had worn in the concentration camp and that he had brought with him to Cuba, as you see her holding it there close to her heart. So I had these incredibly deep experiences with people in the Jewish community in Cuba. Here, Sada and her husband, she's holding up the ketubah, the marriage contract that belonged to her parents and that she had inherited and held on to. It was very, very moving. And then she had this picture of herself at the quinceañera, the 15th birthday party that was held for all of these young women in 1959, the year the revolution began. All of these young women turned 15. And in that synagogue that I mentioned to you, the Patronato, they had a big party for all of these young women. And then that's a picture of her there and that flower made, that Jewish star made out of flowers. And she said of all those people, she's the only one still left in Cuba because the majority of the community of 15,000 Jews left Cuba after the revolution. But this 10% of the community stayed in Cuba and decided to remain Jewish in Cuba. I met this man, Jaime Gansgarin, an incredible meeting with him in the eastern end of Cuba, back at that time when I was doing the research, and he had a lot of memorabilia, letters, and photographs from his relatives in Europe that he had held on to. So it was very moving to find this memory of the Jewish presence in Cuba when I was doing my research and find that people were also revitalizing Jewishness and coming back to religious practice as well, starting in the 90s in the last 30 years. And then other interesting phenomenon is that the Cuban government was aware of this growing interest in the Jewish community in Cuba, and they restored this building and turned it into a Jewish-themed hotel. It's called the Hotel Raquel, and it's in the old part of Havana, a really beautiful part of Havana. And we'll definitely go there and have a drink on the trip. And the rooms are all named after biblical figures. And there is a room named Ruth. And so I have sometimes wondered if I ever will find a home again in Cuba, or if there's just a hotel room with my name in Cuba. So there's that part, the anthropology part of my background, and then I'm also a poet as well as a fiction writer, and it was such an emotional experience for me to reconnect with Cuba. I was so grateful for the experience, but it was also just hit me so deep that I wrote a lot of poetry as well. And I wrote this poem, Broken Streets of My City. It was produced in a handmade book in the town of Matanzas by an artist named Rolando Esteves in Spanish and English. And it's about Havana, the broken streets of Havana. You can see some of the streets here. And I wrote about various things that are broken, including some of the tombstones in the Jewish cemetery outside of Havana and Guanabacoa, and just thinking about all the things that hopefully in coming years will be repaired in Cuba. And it's a handwritten, very, very long poem. And I'll read a little bit of it to you. I come back an old child, now they call me Señora. I still come back after so many years, an old little girl, una niña vieja. Mommy, Papi, please come back. Walk these broken streets of our Habana together with me. Listen to me, your niña vieja. Let me lead you through these broken streets. And that's a call to my parents, whom you see here, who have not gone back to Cuba, but I have gone back so many times for them. So all that by way of introduction, and now let me tell you more about Letters from Cuba, the book we're focusing on. So here I am with my maternal grandparents, my Polish and Russian grandparents. I was very, very close to them, as you can just see from this picture as a child growing up in Havana. I really adored them, and fortunately I got to spend a lot of time with them into old age. We left Cuba and settled in New York, but they eventually resettled in Miami, retired to Miami, and I would spend a lot of time with them in the kitchen, my grandmother cooking and baking, and my grandfather always washing the dishes. And I would hear their stories about having migrated to Cuba in the 1920s. It was just so amazing to me coming from Poland and Russia, finding a new life in Cuba. And my grandmother would make things like, if you could see what this recipe is for, it's a recipe for gefilte fish, right? A standard standard food of the Ashkenazi diet. And what I love about this recipe is that you can see how Cubanized she became. The recipe is in Spanish, so it's gefilte fish written out in Spanish, but she wrote the names of the fish on the right-hand corner up there. You can see that, the white fish and the yellow fish and the carp. She wrote the names of the fish in English because she was going to need to go to the fish shop and ask for the fish in English, but then the recipe is there in Spanish. So a beautiful mix of the cultures here, and that was something that I found so fascinating. So my grandmother, as a young woman, went to Cuba all by herself. Her name was Esther, and she left behind her mom and her grandmother and her siblings. In real life, there were seven siblings altogether, and she was the first of all the children to go to Cuba. My great grandfather, Abraham, was already in Cuba at that time, mid 1920s. He had gone first, and he didn't have a lot of luck. He was supposed to be able to save up enough money to bring the whole family, but he just wasn't making it. And after 3 years, he had just enough to bring one of the children to Cuba, and he wanted to bring one of the sons. But the eldest of all the children was my grandmother Esther, and she wrote to him and she insisted that she be the first to go to Cuba. And she told him, I will help you bring all the rest of the family to Cuba. And that's what happened. She was the first to go. And I just thought it was such an incredible story, and I wanted to write something inspired by her. She was from the town of Govorovo, a town not too far from Warsaw, and that I fortunately had the chance to go to once a couple of years ago. And like many others, she took this route, this long route across the ocean to Cuba, from Europe to ocean, from Europe to Cuba, across the ocean. There's the island of Cuba, just so you kind of see how it's shaped and how close it is, 90 miles away from the United States. And why did she go to Cuba? People are always curious. Why did Jewish people go to Cuba? Well, she wanted to come to the United States, as most people did in that period between World War I and World War II. But the US had passed an immigration law that essentially limited the numbers of people that could come to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe. And so here you can see they instituted a quota system, and there were very few people that could enter the United States at that time from Poland and Turkey, which were the two main countries from which people were immigrating to Cuba. Cuba, on the other hand, opened its doors at that time. They were concerned that the population was becoming too black Cuban, and they wanted more immigrants from Europe to settle in Cuba, and so they allowed people in. A lot of people actually migrated from Spain to Cuba in this period, and others from different parts of Europe. So that's why they ended up in Cuba. And the idea was to get to Cuba and then find a way to get to the United States, right? And a lot of people did do that. But what happened to my family, my grandparents and others who settled in Cuba is that they just fell in love with Cuba and they decided we don't need to go anywhere else. This will be our America. And they stayed in Cuba and they built a Jewish life in Cuba and built synagogues and Jewish day schools and a whole Jewish institutional framework. So here is my grandmother with the family reunited. She brought her siblings, she brought her mother to Cuba. They were reunited in a small town in the province of Matanzas. And the man on one end with the sort of Panama hat, that was my great grandfather who started the whole migration process. And my grandmother is the woman seated in the front in the white dress. So I was so fascinated by this, the family reunited and settling in a small town in Cuba, small town in the province of Matanzas. But I was aware that not everybody in the family in Poland decided to go to Cuba. For a long time, I didn't know who this person was. I would see this picture at my grandmother's house. And this was my grandmother's grandmother back in Poland. And she didn't want to go to Cuba because she was afraid that Cuba might be something like a jungle from the little bit of information they could find in Poland at that time. She wasn't sure that she wanted to go. She wanted to hold on to the customs and stay in Poland. And she, like so many others, died in the war, died in the Holocaust. So I always thought it was interesting that the family that left was the family that survived. And I often say I am Jewish because I am Cuban. It was because Cuba offered these immigrants, these refugees, a home at that time that I got to live 2 generations later. So I wrote Lucky Broken Girl, my young adult novel, and there's a character in the novel that's kind of based on this grandmother, and she talks about her journey to Cuba, and she says to the character, the main character in the story, who is Ruthie, she says to her, "One day you will look back on your suffering and you will find a meaning for it, and that will be your story." So that's one of the lines that she says in the book. And then I thought to myself, why don't I just dedicate a whole book to this character inspired by my grandmother? And that's how it came about that I wrote Letters from Cuba, and it's in English and Spanish with this beautiful cover art that really shows so beautifully the journey from one place to another. Up in the top left-hand corner, that's supposed to be Poland, and then the ocean, and coming into Havana there, the lighthouse, and down at the bottom, the palm trees, which is the small agricultural village where Esther in the story is going to go live with her father. And the book is in Spanish. It's really important to me that my books be in English and Spanish, being Cuban after all, and being a Spanish speaker. And so, what inspired me to write this book? I wanted to honor my grandmother Esther and her story, how she traveled alone to Cuba, met up with her father, my great grandfather, and she helped to save her family on the eve of World War II. I wanted to feel what it's like to be an immigrant, especially when you're a young person. I knew a lot about her story, but I had to really get into her heart and her head and try to imagine what that must have been like, what a huge experience that must have been like. I wanted to write about Cuba as a place of many cultures where Jewish people found refuge and a sense of home. And I wanted to write a book in the form of letters. So this book is all written as letters that Esther is writing to her younger sister Malka, who was waiting in Poland to finally be able to go to Cuba as well. So it was a really exciting challenge for me as a writer. Could I write a whole book in the form of letters? So I set the book a little later than when my grandmother actually migrated in 1938. I wanted it to be very close to the beginning of the war in 1939, so it's set in 1938. And then it's also set in this town where my mother's family lived, where my grandmother lived. It's a town called Agramonte, and I've been to the town. This is what it looked like in the 20s and 30s, just show you the historical pictures, which I was able to find in the town among local historians who've done great research about their own town. You can see one of the old stores that was there. And my grandparents and extended family had a store of their own in this small town. And then this is what it looks like today. This is what Agramonte looks like today. And it's kind of what a lot of small towns in Cuba look like. So I was able to go there, do some research for the book, get to know people, find out that they remembered my family from all those years ago. It was really an amazing experience. You can see what it looks like there. And so I started thinking about all the cultures that come together in Cuba, and I wanted to show that mixing of cultures in my book. And so, of course, there's the Spanish Catholic culture that goes back to the era of the conquest in the 15th century. This is supposed to be Columbus in 1492, and then off to the side, the man in the kind of yellow gown and green trim. That's supposed to be Luis de Torres, who's well known to have been a converso, a Sephardic Jew who converted to Catholicism in order to remain in Spain and part of Spain. So he's also represented here in this painting. So there's definitely that culture, which of course is so important in Cuba. But so too is the Afro-Cuban culture and the fact that so many people from Western Cuba were brought to Cuba in the era of slavery. They're largely Yoruba speaking people from West Africa, and they were put to work in the sugarcane fields. And there was lots of sugarcane in this part of Cuba and all over Cuba. That was the major crop, as you probably know. And so Afro-Cuban people developed this very interesting religious sensibility where they mixed Catholicism, which was imposed on them when they got to Cuba. They were forcibly baptized into Catholicism, but they held on to their Yoruba, their West African belief system, and mixed the two together in the most amazing ways. And so this woman who I met there in the town told me about these offerings that are left at the foot of this sacred tree, a ceiba tree. You can see there's a chain around the tree depicting the era of slavery, and people leave offerings there. And she told me about this, and found it so compelling that I incorporated that folklore into the book as well. So young Esther, when she goes to Cuba, she discovers all of this and is trying to make sense of all these cultures that are so different from the culture that she comes from in Poland. The bata drums are very important in religious ritual and also just in entertainment as well. Now, especially, the bata drums are used a lot more. They're drummed on their sides. And they also have a sacred meaning in the religion. So that's something that gets incorporated into the novel as well. And there's also a Chinese community in Cuba that people usually don't know about. There was a really large Chinese community, and this is in Havana. And Chinese people played a major role in Cuba as well, particularly in the 19th century. Many of these Chinese immigrants, particularly men, fought in the Independence War and the Third Independence War in Cuba. And there's this important monument to the memory of those Chinese people that fought for the independence of Cuba. So it's another culture that's also very important. And being an anthropologist, I'm really interested in all of these different cultures and how they come together in Cuba. And that's part of what makes Cuba so fascinating to me, is that you see this mix of cultures on the island. And definitely in the trip, we will see this ourselves and experience it. And of course, there's the Jewish community in Cuba. Coming back again to the synagogue I mentioned before, the Patronato, you can get a better view of it here. And we lived, I mean, we can almost see the building down on the corner where I lived as a child. So there's also this Jewish community, also part of the mixed cultures of Cuba. And as I was saying, it was a really, really major Jewish community center built right on the eve of the revolution in the mid 1950s. 1953, they started building this beautiful synagogue Jewish community center that's still there and still actively used. And it was built by these Jewish people that were expecting to stay on the island forever, that community of 15, 20,000 that left soon after the revolution in the 60s, but they thought they'd be there for a very long time. So it's very, very poignant. And here to show you just how important the Jewish presence was, you can see on this map that there were Jewish communities all over the island, 5 synagogues in its heyday in Havana, but synagogues all over the island of Cuba, down to the eastern end, Guantanamo and Santiago de Cuba, and in the central part of Cuba as well. And you find Jewish cemeteries in the most unexpected places as well, and I got to visit all of them in Banes and Camajuani, very small towns. There are these Jewish cemeteries as well. So the Jewish presence is there in this amazing and fascinating way, and the synagogues are still there, and the Jewish communities, though very small now, are still there all over Cuba, with the largest concentration in Havana now. So the Jewish community really became part of the island and thought of themselves naturally as Cuban, and would go to the Tropicana nightclub, which has been revitalized and exists again in Havana. And you see this wonderful ad for the Tropicana in Spanish and Yiddish. And there was great affection, still is great affection for Jose Marti, the great independence leader of Cuba. And this is a poem that was written by Aronofsky, who was a Yiddish-speaking poet. He wrote the poem in Yiddish, then it was translated into Spanish. Here I have an English version for you.
Ruth, I'm just going to interrupt real quick. We can't see your PowerPoint. I don't know if that you're showing that to us, but it's not on your screen anymore. We
Oh,
we saw it for most of when you've been talking about in the past few minutes. It's gone back
oh,
to camera.
I can see
oh,
it fine.
Yes,
Oh, you can.
I can also
I
see
can,
Oh,
it.
sorry about
me
that.
too. Yeah, me too.
I can see it
Oh,
fine.
sorry about that.
okay.
For some
Yeah,
reason, it's
I
not
see
coming through
it.
on mine, but if it's coming through on everyone else's, then
Yeah,
that's
It
good. I
is.
just wanted to make sure
Double
we
check,
weren't missing it.
maybe there's something. Yeah,
Okay.
but they're telling me, and definitely if something
It's
true.
perfect here.
Okay.
There's a tab that says Ruth Bihar's screen at the top of ours that we had to activate to get it back.
Ah, maybe that's it. Okay.
It's gone for me.
Oh, maybe it's been on for too long or
Oh,
something.
yes. If you hit that Ruth Behar screen at the top, I just did and it came back. So I
Yeah,
don't know,
I think
why that
Zoom
happened,
has
but
been
that's how you can get it
changing.
back if you don't see it.
Zoom has been changing some settings in the last few weeks, so that's why it's a bit confusing. But yes, I
Okay.
never lost it, but if you click there, you will be able to go back to it.
Oh, good, good, good.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry for the interruption.
No, 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 no. I'll try to go a little faster. Maybe I'm going too slow. Um, so anyway, so in this poem, Aronofsky talks about blessed land, singing amid sugarcane and tobacco to its rising paradise. So there's this great love for Cuba that the Jewish community had and continues to have, those who are still there, and those who left continue to think back to Cuba with great love and affection and so much nostalgia, which is what led me to want to go to Cuba, because there was just so much nostalgia in my family for Cuba. And here you see an image of Jose Marti. He actually spent part of his life in Cuba, part of his life in Spain, and part of his life in New York, and wrote some of his most famous poems in the Catskill Mountains, wrote in Spanish. And one of his poems that's well known is this Cultivating a White Rose poem, where it's just beautiful poem, where he talks about giving a white rose to his friend, but also to his enemy. And this is a poem that Cuban Jews all know, and that children today in Cuba still recite every day in school and learn by heart. So anyway, so this connection again to Cuba, to its history, its leaders, its independence dreams, and so on, is very, very interesting. So all of this I had in mind, and I was trying to think, how would a young person learn, to go back to Jose Marti for a moment, how would a young person learn Spanish? And so in the novel, young Esther learns Spanish by reading the poems of Jose Marti. She's given a book of his poems by a neighbor in this small town where she and her father are living, and that's how she connects with the Spanish language. So all those different identities and cultures come together in the book: the Spanish, the African, the Chinese, the Jewish. Esther learns from friends and neighbors about this new culture, this new place, this new identity. She has the doctor as one of their neighbors, and his wife. Then there's a friend that she makes with Manuela and her grandmother, and the grandmother herself was once an enslaved person in a plantation there in the area, and that's so interesting. And then she makes friends with a young boy, Francisco Chang, who is Chinese Cuban and is helping his uncle Juan Chang in the general store. So I create characters out of those cultures, and they all support Esther and her papa, her father, against a very horrible, the villain in the book is Senor Eduardo, who owns a plantation and is very, very, very cruel to his workers and cruel to Esther and her father. And then there are these Jewish characters in Havana who are storekeepers, Rivka Rubinstein and Zvi Mandelbaum, who kind of help to show them their way around Jewish Cuba. So some of the characters in the book that are super interesting. So I had to figure out, in writing a novel and not an anthropology book, I had a certain amount of freedom in what could happen in the story. And I wondered, how will Esther bring her family to safety in Cuba? In real life, my grandmother did it by selling fabric, but I thought, I'm going to change this a little bit. It's a novel, it's fictional. So I thought about the magic of sewing dresses, because my grandmother liked to sew, as did her sisters. Sewing was something they did. They made dresses. And then I knew about the famous department store El Encanto, which we'll see a picture of in a minute. Here's an alternate cover for the book with the dress there in the center and the letters. And so there was this very famous department store in Havana called El Encanto, the Enchantment. And I thought, well, what if somehow Esther gets to make dresses and her dresses end up for sale in El Encanto? And so she's able to make enough money to help her father bring the family to Cuba. And so that's what happens. And you have to read the whole book to kind of see exactly how. But it was a store that had these very, very elegant dresses, some of them from Paris and New York. So I thought that was so interesting, from this period in the 30s and 40s. And so there's the dresses, and then the other part was the letters. And I thought that the letters would be kind of this magical thing where Esther is writing all these letters to her sister Malka. And the more letters she writes telling her about her experiences in Cuba, the more likely it is that Malka will have to come to Cuba to read the letters. The letters will be a kind of magnet that will pull her to Esther, and they will be reunited. So that's something else. And again, you've got to read the book to kind of see how that all works out. And so I did some research on this, and the letter form was such an important form of communication back at that time, and people were taught how to write proper letters. So I looked at those, and those became part of the inspiration for the format of the book. And just to show you here, so this is one of the early letters. And this is Esther. She's still on the way to Cuba and has all these fears, of course, traveling all by herself to Cuba on a ship. That's when my fears about this journey become difficult to shoo away. I am crossing the ocean, but it feels as if the ocean is crossing me. And so through the letter, she expresses all of these feelings and emotions and hopes and dreams. Here's the letter that I just read to you in Spanish. Estoy cruzando el océano, pero se siente como si el océano me cruzara a mí. Right. So it's in English and Spanish, but it was very important to me that I see what at least one letter would have looked like in Yiddish, because Esther's language, her first language, would have been Yiddish. She would have known Polish as well. And then she was learning Spanish in Cuba. So I had a translator translate that letter that I just showed you into Yiddish, just so I could see what it would have looked like in Yiddish if I had been able to write the book in Yiddish. And here it is in print form. So it's a book that means so much to me because I wanted to address my grandmother's story and honor my grandmother's story. And so then I started talking to Sage Lewis, who you're going to hear from today, Project Por Amor, and to Al Nodal, his partner in Project Por Amor. And I love the way they organize travel, very ethical, very deeply connected to the people that they get to meet and the places they go to, particularly Cuba. And so we started cooking up this idea of, why don't we do a trip to Cuba where we focus on the book and have people going to Cuba read the book in English, and then meet with people in Cuba who will have read the book in Spanish, people in the Jewish community and in the intellectual and literary community as well, who will all have read the book, and we'll have a kind of shared book club with the travelers coming from the US and people that we know and will get to know in Cuba, having read the same book, and have a dialogue about this book and the story that it tells about Cuba and how Cuba offered a home to so many Jews, and that's how they were able to survive. And this is just a letter that symbolizes the hope, the kind of the hope that I had in writing this book. So many people are looking for a place to call home. I want to imagine that the world has a very large heart and can give all of us who have lost our homes a chance to start over. And for my family, the place that gave them that chance to start over was Cuba. And that's one of the reasons I remain very, very grateful to Cuba and feel a deep connection to the island. And really look forward to this trip that we're organizing to go to Cuba, to go to some of the sites that are mentioned in the book, and to really get to know Cuba as deeply as we can. So thank you so much for listening. I think we have some time now for questions.
Yes,
And
thank you very much, Ruth. Yes, we will go to questions now. I will go in order. There were a few on the chat, but some of them you may already have answered. So I wanted to know how your mother made money to bring relatives. I think you mentioned, but if you want to expand a bit on that.
sure, yeah. So she started working in a fabric store, and that was she was saving money from that. And then she met in real life. She met my grandfather, who you saw in some of the early pictures, my maternal grandfather, and he also was working and helped as well. So between the two of them, saving money. And then my great grandfather, who wasn't very, very good at business or saving money, he too, though, got involved and was able to help a bit as well. But it was really the three of them working together that in real life brought the family to Cuba. In the fictional version, since it's a novel, I gave myself a little bit more freedom to make it a little bit more magical. So it happens a lot faster, and Esther gets this big break where she makes these dresses and they get into El Encanto, so she's paid very, very generously for her dresses. So I made it a little different in the novel, but in real life it was from fabric, selling fabric that they were able to bring the family to Cuba. And really right on the verge, just a couple of years before the war. So that was quite spectacular. Yeah.
Okay, and what is the age range for readers of the book?
Readers.
Is it a young adult fiction?
Yeah, so basically ages 11 and up is considered the reader range. So the nice thing is if you're a grandparent, you could read it with a grandchild who's 10, 11, 12. But it's also a book that so many adults have written to me and just said, I just like this book. I know it's intended for young adults, but I'm just reading it because I found it so interesting. So I'm thinking of it as an all ages book, but it is exciting. The kids can read the book and understand it and learn about this immigration story. I'm finding out from public schools in the United States, and also Jewish schools and other schools, private schools as well, that they read the book in their section about immigration, because it's an immigrant story that isn't usually covered, and they find it so interesting that it's an immigrant story to Cuba. So lots of young people are reading it and have read it, but lots of adults as well are finding it interesting.
Thank you. I'm going to combine here two questions that are kind of connected. How did Cuban Jews fare under Batista, and then Batista's dictatorship, and then why some left and the majority left after the revolution, and why the 10% that stayed decide to stay?
Yeah. So overall, during the Batista period, I would say most of the Jews were doing well. They had small businesses. These are small businesses that they built over time because mostly when they arrived in the teens, 20s, and 30s, they were very poor. They came penniless. They worked as street peddlers. This was true of both of my grandfathers, worked as street peddlers in Havana and beyond Havana as well. So they started out quite poor, but then by the 40s and 50s, they prospered. Most of them had small shops, mom and pop shops. Some were larger merchants. Not everybody prospered, though. My paternal grandfather, the Sephardic grandfather, remained a peddler up until the day he left Cuba. So people overall were doing well, but they had basically prospered in those earlier decades, and then by the 50s, when Batista was governing, they were doing well, relatively well, I would say, economically. That was when they built their synagogues as well, and were expecting again to stay on the island and and be there for many generations. Then the reason that they left, the reason that so many left in the 60s, when the revolution began in 59, the majority of the Jewish community was in support of Castro and Che Guevara and the revolution. And like most Cubans, they thought that Cuba did need a change. They were doing well economically, but they knew that they were living under a dictatorship under Batista. And so they supported Fidel Castro. My father tells me stories of right around 56, 57, 58, in that era of the guerrilla warfare in the Sierra Maestra, that he would listen to the radio. There was the Radio Rebelde, the rebel radio, as it was called, and it was radio from the mountains of the Sierra Maestra where Fidel Castro and the other rebels were stationed. And it was against the law, it was against Batista's law to listen to that radio station. And he would secretly listen to it because he wanted to know about this revolution like so many other people did, and they thought it was going to bring about democracy. They thought it was going to bring about a positive change in the society. And then they were very disappointed by the reforms that started to be made. The first reforms they were thrilled about. My parents were thrilled. One of the first urban reforms in 1959 was to reduce rents by half. And my parents were renting that apartment in Havana that I've mentioned that was so near the synagogue. They were renting it, and suddenly their rent was reduced by half. So they were very happy, and they thought, wow, this is going to be wonderful. But then they started nationalizing properties, and initially nationalizing large properties like plantations and things like that, and banks, and large economic or financial industries. But then they started nationalizing smaller and smaller properties, including small shops, for example, that so many Jewish Cubans owned in that period, and not allowing people to even peddle on the street. So you couldn't even do street peddling anymore. The government took control of the whole economy, presumably to make things better for the whole society. But that was something that felt very threatening to the Jewish community because they were all small entrepreneurs, basically. So that led to many of them deciding to leave. And then the other factor was that Fidel Castro led a literacy campaign in 1961, which was a very positive thing in many ways because they taught people how to read and write all over Cuba. They sent young people from Havana to the countryside to teach people to read and write, which was a great idea. But then the next part of the project was also to nationalize the schools and to create one big national school system. And in the Jewish community, most people sent their children to Jewish day schools like the one that I was sent to myself, where instruction was in Yiddish and Spanish. And all those schools, they were afraid would eventually be shut down. They weren't shut down yet in 61, but they were afraid that they would be. And sure enough, a couple of years later, those schools were shut down and nationalized. So that was the other fear, that the Jewish schools would be shut down, and that eventually they also wouldn't be able to practice their religion. And indeed, eventually they did essentially make atheism the national ideology. So those were all the reasons that led to the Jewish exodus out of Cuba. And it really was an exodus because they left in large numbers, particularly in 61, 62. And, there were 80 to 90% of the community just left at that time, resettled largely in Miami, and others went to New York as well as my family did. But the 10% that stayed, the 10, 15, 20% that stayed initially, these were people that supported the revolution. There were Jewish Cubans who wanted to be part of the revolution, and some had even fought with the rebels, a couple of them, and they believed in the revolution, wanted to be part of it. They were Jewish communists, and they wanted to stay for the revolution. They were the minority, but they were a real group of people as well. And then there were others who maybe weren't that sort of supportive of the revolution, but stayed anyway, partly perhaps because they had married out of the Jewish tribe and felt that they were very connected to Cuba and didn't want to leave the island. So there's kind of a range. And then there were people also, the third group, I would say, were people who didn't have the possibility of leaving, who didn't have the connections, the contacts, the everything that it took to be able to be an immigrant. So that too had something to do with it.
Thank you, Ruth. I will read two more questions, and then we will move on to the next part of our presentation. And at the end, if there is time, we will go back to any unanswered questions that have been left. So what is the state of the cemeteries? You mentioned there were cemeteries all over the island. So what is the state today in those places where there are probably no more Jews living there? And what is the level of anti-Semitism today in Cuba?
Yeah. So the cemeteries are largely in okay condition, but some tombstones are not. And it has to do with the fact that it's difficult to travel to Cuba, that a lot of people, after having left, have not wanted to go back. It's too painful for them to see how Cuba has changed. They do not want to go back. And so a lot of the tombstones aren't taken care of because the family of those that are in the cemetery are no longer there to take care of the tombstones. But there have been people who have traveled back. There is a person who takes care of cemetery keeper who takes care there's two cemeteries on the outskirts of Havana in Guanabacoa, a small town outside of Havana. And there's one is largely Ashkenazi, one is largely Sephardic. And they do have cemetery keepers that take care of the tombstones, but sometimes they just don't have enough materials and so on to be able to take care of the tombstones properly. It's also a very difficult climate, and in the tropical climate, it's very, very difficult to maintain the stones and so on. So some are better cared for than others. There are people that send money to the cemetery keeper on a regular basis, and so those are better kept. Others are not so well kept. But it is interesting to see that they remain in Cuba. They haven't been desecrated in any way. They remain in Cuba and they are respected. Overall, from everything I hear from people living in Cuba today, they do not feel anti-Semitism in Cuba, even though Cuba does not have official relations with the state of Israel, though there are Israeli investments in Cuba, but they do not have official relations. So despite that, everybody that I've spoken to says that they feel very comfortable in Cuba. They do not feel anti-Jewish hatred, and certainly my family felt very, very comfortable in Cuba. It was something that my grandmother, the protagonist of Letters from Cuba, always said, that she just felt like when she got to Cuba, she just breathed a breath of fresh air, that it was such a different feeling to not feel that people were staring down at you and just automatically hating you for who you were. She just never felt that in Cuba. And from all of my experiences traveling to Cuba, I've certainly never felt any kind of hatred directed at me because of my Jewish identity.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And like I said, I know there are many questions. Unfortunately, we cannot answer all of them now. Hopefully, we will have time at the end after we have spoken about the tour. So, Sage, please feel free to share your screen and tell us about the trip.
Hi, everyone. Let me get my screen up here. So I am the founder and president of Project Por Amor. We do cultural tours, educational tours like in Cuba, primarily, also Iceland as well. But my partner Adolfo and Odell, we've been doing we do about 10 trips a year, and each one is very meticulously customized and thought through and planned. Very, very unique, because we just, if you're going to go to Cuba, you really gotta, you might only go to Cuba once in your life. Some people love Cuba and keep going back, but there's a lot. Cuba is a very amazing, fascinating country, and in a week, we just want to show that to you as much as possible. This tour is very special with Ruth. We've been planning this tour actually since 2018, and we had it all planned and it was all set up. It's a lot of meetings thinking through it, and then the pandemic happened, and so that postponed it a lot. But then we we got back onto it, and now it's been about a year or so. We've been finishing our plans for this tour. So I think the questions, I'm going to go into the itinerary, and the main thing I want to do is show you exactly, just give you a sense of what this experience is going to be like, what we're going to be doing during our week there. But we've a lot of people ask, why go on group tour. I like to travel by myself, and or the reason to go on a tour like this is because you get to travel. Ruth designed this, and to spend a week in Cuba with a writer and intellectual like Ruth, who knows Cuba so extremely well and has devoted a lot of her life to really carefully thinking about all these different uh, historical and cultural elements of Cuba in a way like few others have. I met Ruth, I think it was about 10 or more years ago. She was it was in Cuba. She was leading a tour for the MacArthur Genius Award winners. They have a whole community of people who've won the award that she has as well. And so she was leading a tour of putting for all those distinguished thinkers, and we became friends and stayed in touch. And she's been friends for many decades with my partner Adolfo, who's in Cuba right now, so he couldn't be here, but he's a Cuban American and a big arts advocate, and so Ruth designed this tour. We designed it together, but this is really Ruth's. It's like how she puts her life experiences and all her thoughts into her writing and poetry and academic work that she does. She also put it into this itinerary, really connecting with a lot of special people in the Jewish Cuban community, people who are good friends of hers, and really thinking through, if you're going to spend a week in Cuba, how can you really experience and immerse yourself in this. So I'm just want to go into, I'm going to go out of this real quick. Sorry, it doesn't look as pretty, but we have the itinerary. It's on the online information about the tour. And I just want to go through some of the highlights just so you get a sense. Where it's really a combination of literature, getting really deep into the literature from many perspectives of Cuba, and literature about Cuba, and Ruth's writing, and other Cuban novelists, and then also really connecting with the Jewish community in a way that's doesn't normally happen, as not able to to go to a country and do in a way like we're planning to happen on this trip. And so for example, with that, the Friday, which will be the first full day, we're going to have Shabbat with a lecture, kind of an orientation, introduction presentation, what Ruth, kind of like the one she gave, but to go further into all the topics she's been talking about, and then evening services and Shabbat dinner at the Patronato synagogue with the Jewish community, and then to get to sit down and break bread and observe Shabbat and spend the evening with them is going to be very meaningful. I'm going to go back because earlier this day there's something really cool where the concert with the Camerata Romeu, which is an all-female string orchestra, classical music orchestra that performs music of Cuban composers as well as other Latin American composers, and they perform non-Latin American music too. But their mission is really to champion the music of Cuban and other Latin American composers, and they have a private visit with them, with the maestra Zenaida over here, who's from a long legacy of great Cuban classical musicians and composers of many generations of her parents, uncle, grandparents, and stuff like that. And she's a big pillar of the Cuban classical music. So we're going to meet with her. They're going to perform for us in this beautiful old synagogue. So there's also going to be mixed in with this many just experiences, a panorama of Cuban culture, and just understanding Cuba at large, the Jewish community within that, and many literary perspectives on that. So then on Saturday morning, we're going to meet with the Centro Hebreo Sephardi, the Sephardic Center, which is close to the Patronato Synagogue and another strong community of Jewish community. And then we're a discussion with a Cuban novelist. This is here Leonardo Padura, who's Cuban's probably most well-known novelist living in Cuba, writes crime fiction, detective novels. He has a famous series called Four Seasons, which was turned into a Netflix series, which is on Netflix right now, produced by Netflix. And during the Obama years, it was produced when there was a normalization of our relationship with Cuba, and there's a whole lot more exchange happening. We're going to be having really incredible Cuban food. Cuba has 20 years ago, people go to Cuba and they would say, it was one of the greatest travel experience I've been on, but the food was horrible. It was almost inedible because that was at a time where all the restaurants were government run, and now they've been one of the first private sector businesses to start in Cuba about 20 years ago was they call it Paladar, which is a restaurant in the home of a family where they cook for you, and that sort of expanded. And there's this foodie culture happening, this whole scene of these really creative cuisine. And so we're going to be, going to the best ones and really enjoying the Cuban flavors. Then one of the most exciting parts of this trip, I think, is this trip is really like a book club, and the fact that everyone goes on this tour, we're going to send you a copy of Letters from Cuba, so you can read it before the trip. And then we're also sending 30 copies or so to the Patronato Synagogue of Cartas de Cuba, which is the Spanish version of the book, and they're going to be giving it to Cuban members of the community who are also going to read it. And then we're going to come together at the synagogue for a book discussion where we can all sit around and we'll have interpreters and really get into the discussion because this book is all about history and about the story of the Jewish story, the Cuban story, how those come together. And from the different perspectives, many perspectives around the table, to use the book as a vehicle for a very deep, very real human connection of our lives and our histories and our futures and our present. And that's going to be really exciting and really meaningful time to connect with the Cuban people. So then after that, we'll be followed by the synagogue has a very passionate youth dance team or dance group, and they're going to perform. And then the Fábrica de Arte Cubano is one of the most amazing art spaces. It was called by, I think it was Forbes magazine, one of the 100 places to visit in the world. It's just work, music, visual art, dance, theater, film, and all the arts come together in this old warehouse that's huge and been remodeled in a really creative way. So also we're going to see a lot of visual art. Talk to Cristina Vives, who's a curator, very interesting contemporary curator, and her daughter Cristinita. The two of them are well-known curators. And so that's kind of a sense. There's a lot of stuff. There's the National Museum of Fine Arts Cuban collection, where we're going to go through the history of Cuba through the eyes of its painters as they portray that in visual art. Some time on your own. There's an amazing jazz scene in Havana. Right now it's happening on rooftops all around the city, where they have great bars and restaurants, and under the stars, really top world level groups play. I guess you could call it Latin jazz. They're jazz musicians, but they bring all the Cuban rhythms and the Cuban music into the way they play jazz. So then we're also going to have a symposium on Cuban literature that we're organizing, where at Cuba Libro, this really cool book center started by an American who's been living in Cuba for 20 years or more. And presentation, a larger presentation on the Jewish literature of Cuba. And then Ruth's husband, Professor David Fry, who's also an anthropologist and translator, and has specialized in translating the poems of Jose Marti, which Ruth was referencing earlier in her talk, as well as Dulce Maria Loines, to learn more about that, and then a wrap up in conversation with Ruth and David and the whole group. More great food and visit to Dulce Maria's house and Jose Marti's house, who we were discussing earlier. So then there's one kosher restaurant in Cuba called Chateau Blanc, and started by Sal Barenthal, and his family now runs it, and they're a very interesting family to meet. So also just a conversation with Patrick Oppman, the CNN international correspondent and Havana bureau chief, for a conversation about what's going on in Cuba today with their economy, the political system, all the topics that you're going to become more and more curious about understanding while you're there. Visit to the Jewish cemeteries in Guanabacoa that Ruth was also referencing. And so more artist studio visits, and then celebrate at the end. You can't go to Cuba without riding, and there are classic American convertibles from the 50s and 40s that are still operating all over the island. Almost half the cars are still these old cars. And then another project that we do in Cuba is we've had a neon sign restoration project with this artist Kadir Lopez and my partner Adolfo, and we're going to this artist Kadir's house, and it's a neon workshop where there's still the 50s. Havana was a city of light. There's neon, everywhere, and there's most of it's gone, but there's still a lot of these old signs remaining, and so we're part of a project that's been restoring these signs, and so we're going to go there, have a final party with live music. And that's kind of what the experience is going to be like. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint presentation. And so what's really cool about this is these are all things that are almost impossible to experience on your own unless you went to Cuba and lived there, for a long time and started to meet a lot of these people and on your own. So it's just going to be a week just packed. We have a very beautiful hotel. Like I was saying with the restaurant scene in Havana, how there's these private restaurants that have gotten very creative all over in people's homes. The same thing ever since the Trump administration came in 8 years ago or so, 7 years ago, and imposed a law saying that we're not allowed to stay in the hotels in Cuba, which was really a way of truncating U.S. travel to Cuba. And so Cuba is a very innovative and resourceful country. And one of the responses was, we can stay in the casas particulares, these small boutique hotels. And so they have these beautiful mansions all over Havana. And so the Cubans started taking those and restoring them to become these beautiful little bed and breakfasts. And so we can't stay in those, and the trip is under the Support for the Cuban People license. So we're going to Cuba to support the Cuban people. In this case, it's mostly the Jewish Cuban community, but also the Cuban people at large. And so these private businesses, there's these beautiful boutique hotels all over. So one of our favorites is the Hotel Alameda, which it's very friendly, beautiful architecture. Each room is a little different, a lot of thought and care they put into every element of it. And they're really fun. It's right in the neighborhoods, right in Vedado. And so it has so Cuba is able to take more tourists and foreigners, is these these interesting little hotels have been popping up pretty rapidly over the past 7 years or so. And so the trip is the cost of it is 4,660 for a double occupancy if you're sharing a room, and if you have your own room, it's 5,140. And there's more details in the online brochure of everything that's included. It's a pretty much all-inclusive tour. I think there's 1 or 2 dinners on your own just to be able to explore on your own, which is also a lot of fun and important to do that. But otherwise, airfare is not included because people will be coming from all over the world for this trip, and it's pretty easy. We just guide you through all the how to prepare for the trip, and how to get the airplane tickets and everything like that. And we'll do the visas. We do a pre-trip orientation, lots of emails about like going into the prepare about how the license works for the legal travel from the United States, and a whole list of books and movies, Cuban movies, Cuban music, ways to get into Cuban culture ahead of the time, which really enriches the experience while you're there. This is, would be, in addition to letters from Cuba. But Cuba really has quite a canon of literature and film and the arts with such a rich culture as a way of understanding their history and their culture, and from so many different point of views. So Cuba's also can be a very confusing country to travel to. It's very, very different from the United States in so many ways. And there's a lot of rules on both the US side and the Cuban side. And so we've designed this tour so it adheres to all the laws from the US Treasury as they are right now. And then with the visas and everything on the Cuban side. So also how to pack, what to bring. Also in terms of if supporting the Cuban people more, there's a fair amount of scarcity in Cuba with certain things. There's not many stores. There's not much to buy there. So we just walk you through everything to make that as clear as possible around all that. So that's basically the trip, and we're very excited for it. This is a trip that, as I said, we've been planning for 6 years now, and we're expecting this to be a very successful trip, a very great experience that we would hope to repeat as an annual trip, but we don't know if we're going to be able to repeat it every year because it's a lot of it's very complicated to put together something like this. And also Ruth is very busy and is a writer, is a teacher and scholar, and speaking all over the place. And so just to have Ruth to do a trip like this is a huge privilege for us, a giant honor. And it's something that we hope this can be something that we can always do every year together. But we don't know if this is something that's going to go on every year or not. So if it's something you would really like to do, I would really recommend jumping on this opportunity because we know we're going to do it in this May, and so we'd really love for you all to be part of it. And the other thing I forgot to say, which is also really important, the trip is beyond Ruth leading this trip. It's also we'll have a really great leadership to help make everything run smoothly and offer so many perspectives. Adolfo Nodal, can't be in this call right now, but he's also going to be in Cuba as a tour leader. He's my partner, and he's been very involved in the arts in Cuba and in Los Angeles around the U.S. for 25 years or more, and he's a really great perspective. The tour guide for the trip is our friend Abelito, who's a young Jewish Cuban in his early 20s, very a leader within the Jewish community. He has his own Jewish Cuban tour operator, and who we're partnering with for this. And he's also his mom is the vice president of the Patronato Synagogue, and he's also a professor of computer programming at the engineering university in Havana. He's also in his graduate school there at the same time, and developing a thesis on using artificial intelligence and algorithms to help improve the Cuban national agriculture, which is very fascinating. Really busy guy, very, very, very interesting, friendly guy. And so he's going to be with us the whole time. And then we also are going to have another person of our team from Project Poramore, Margot Dinerman, and who's also on this call. And oops, sorry. If Margot, if you can turn your camera on and say hello, it'd be great for people to get a chance to meet you. Sorry for.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, it can.
Did you
Let
want
me
me to
stop
say?
my screen share. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. How are you? Just very quickly, I also have an extended experience in Cuba. I wrote my master's thesis on Afro-Cuban folklore and mythology, but from a dance angle. So I lived in Cuba from 1989 to 2000 when my son was born there. Also Jewish. I currently live in San Diego, and so I've had a long history with the island, and I'm really excited about joining you on this tour as part of the team, and excited to meet you all.
Great. So I guess we just have 10 or 15 minutes left. We would love to answer any questions that people might have about any about the tour or anything that part of in Ruth's presentation.
Yes, thank you, Sage. Thank you very much. So let's go through the first the questions about the tour. I received some in private that probably you didn't see. For some reason, I received them on my private chat. If you could, sorry, speak specifically and a bit in more detail about the specific hotels, like accommodation in general, like on all the places where people are gonna be staying, how many days in every place. It was a bit, for some people, a bit fast, the description.
Oh yeah. So the dates, it's 7 days, including the 2 travel days, and the accommodations are very well. We have the whole hotel to ourselves, and there's 16 rooms, so that's our capacity for the group size, and each room is they're very comfortable. They have their air conditioning, private bathrooms, the options to have separate beds or a queen or king size bed. And a lot of this hotel is it's an old 1920s or so mansion from the Velado neighborhood, which is now more of the downtown kind of center neighborhood where most things happen in Havana. But it's still a residential neighborhood of and right located close to the ocean and to Old Havana. And we have breakfast there. They have very, very good Cuban breakfast. They have a small pool, a dining room, a rooftop, a bar and restaurant, a patio, and it's I just stayed there a month ago when I was there with leading a preservation architectural tour that we were doing, and it's a great place. Very, very friendly staff. The style of it is it's very antiques. A lot of kind of historical furniture and lamps and furniture of classic of the style of Cuban in the first half of the 20th century. So it has a lot of charm, and it has Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi in Cuba is slower overall than most countries in the world, so it's not a great Wi-Fi for streaming things or doing things that require high bandwidth. But it's got some of the best Wi-Fi that you'll find in Cuba, and it also has a generator. So Cuba right now is having a situation where they have challenges to their electric infrastructure and some power outages that are for the most part planned. Less so in Havana; it's mostly in the countryside where we won't be going. This whole trip will be in Havana. But places like our hotel and other places, they have generators. So if there is the electricity is turned off for usually it's about a 4-hour period. That doesn't happen where we're staying, or most of the places we'll be going to. They turn everything back on with their own generator until the power grid gets turned back on. So that's, I guess, everything I can think of for the accommodations. Is there anything else that I missed?
Is there a single supplement?
Sorry, what supplement?
Single supplement. So
Oh
people
yeah, the
don't know.
single supplement, well, is the cost of the trip is about 500, I guess, $480 more for $580 more for the single room. It's 4,660 for double occupancy per person, because the price of the room is shared. So if you have your own room, it's $580 additional to the cost of the trip for a single supplement.
Thank you. And are all meals included? I don't know if you mentioned that or.
Yes, all meals are included, except for 2 dinners where they're on your own. But all the lunches are included, all the breakfasts are included, and most of the dinners are included. And then in terms of bringing money to Cuba to spend, most of it is for going out when you're on your own. There's a couple, well, every afternoon we have about 3 hours after the program for the day. Around 4 o'clock we end the program, and then we have a few hours to relax at the hotel or go explore on your own before we get together for evening activities, and then or the evening on your own. And so that's what you bring personal spending money for, all in cash, because with the US and Cuba, with the embargo, US banking institutions aren't allowed to operate in Cuba. So you can't use your credit cards or your bank anyway digitally. So we bring cash. But Cuba is one of the safest countries in the Americas. I think the crime rates are the second lowest after Canada. It's very safe country, which is one of the great things about going there. So yeah, that's any other questions?
What's the general age range, the people you're expecting, the travelers?
Well, the range is this is a trip designed mostly it's designed for adults. It's not designed for children. We have had children come on our trips, and I guess if you have kids under the age of 16, maybe to inquire first, and it would be better to just have a conversation about what that would look like, because we have had kids come on our trips and it's been a very good experience for them. But for the most part, this trip is designed for older teenagers or adults. We normally get a range, but usually I'd say the majority of people going on a trip like this are between the ages of 50 and 80 or so. So I think would be more to expect in terms of who's going on the trip. The trip is also mostly designed for people who are interested in Cuba literature and Judaism. It's not exclusively for Jewish people, but it'll probably be mostly Jewish people traveling on the trip. But everyone is welcome if this is a trip that's interesting, no matter who you are.
Thank you. And so someone said that the information says the minimum is 22 people. Is there a maximum?
Yeah, 20 to 30 people is going to be the size of the trip. And that kind of depends on how many people are going a single rooms or double rooms. But so it's a good size. It's right. It's in our experience, it's kind of the perfect size. Having a group more than 20 people allows us to do a lot of the things that we can't do in smaller groups. And it's also small enough that to do all the things we want to do that we couldn't do in a group that's too big. So it's kind of the sweet spot for a trip like this. And it's a lot of fun to have a group of 20, 30 people because, part of the thing that's great about these tours is all the Cuban people we connect with, because Cubans are very friendly, very charismatic, very social, kind and nice and fun people. But the people that we expect to go on this trip are also, it's a very a cross section of people from around the world, and probably primarily the United States and Canada and Europe and Israel, but it'll be an international group, and it's always a fun group to travel with, just because of the types of people that are attracted to it, such a specific type of tour. And then with Kesher and Ruth's, all of Ruth's readers and followers and people in our community of travelers, we tend to get a lot of very nice, fun people. And so being in Cuba for some reason is also a very bonding experience. And we recommend, if you do want to go on this trip, to invite friends and family, because it's a really great way to experience life and experience the world with other people in a way that is very unique and different from what we do in our day-to-day lives and in the all the bubbles that we live in and the day-to-day. So you end up becoming very close with the other people on the tour. I think it's partly because of the experience that you share. Going to Cuba is an emotional experience. It's an inspiring experience. It's full of highs and lows of extremes, and I don't mean lows in terms of anything to be worried about. It's just that some of the hardships in Cuba and the history of the country, and things like the blackouts I was talking about, it's a lot to get into right now, but it's what we'll be doing throughout the trip. But it's an emotional place. But the highs are the highs are so powerful in Cuba. They're so moving, and they have a way of touching people so deeply that they outweigh the lows in a way that it just makes it an experience that people will remember for the rest of their lives. And it's what makes traveling to Cuba so special. And you'll understand that by the end of the trip. It's kind of hard to describe.
Thank you very much, Sage. I will read one more that came because Nadine is doing a great job also answering on the chat, so that's saving us some time. So if you could talk a little bit about visiting the rest of the country independently after the trip.
Yeah, so that's another thing, is a lot of the times people who will travel to Cuba on a tour like this want to spend more time there, have more time on their own, especially after you've spent a week with a program like this, where you really get introduced to so many things in a very intensive way that it takes a long time to kind of process and unpack such a high concentration of experiences like this. So staying after, I recommend a little more than maybe coming early. However, they're both optional. And we help with a visa and the travel license from the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the U.S. Treasury, all that stuff to allow you to do that. And then we can extend your hotel reservation, and we can give you a lot of suggestions on tips on what to do, how to maybe if you want to go to the countryside, or what you'd like to do in Cuba. We typically don't like book all that for you and be responsible for it as like a travel agent or something like that. But we will answer all the questions you have phone calls, anything you want, to give you suggestions of how to do that and how to make it an experience, a trip on your own, exactly as you would like to have as well.
Great, thank you very much. I just want to remind you all that tomorrow you will receive an email with the recording of this presentation, all the information you need to sign up, to read more about the itinerary, to get in touch with the Project Por Amor. So you don't need to be taking notes. You will be able to do it everything tomorrow on your own time. So those were all the questions that came about the tour. People want to know how they can sign up, so you can go to if you want to put in the chat the link to the registration page. Anyway, we will share it tomorrow. Ruth, if you don't mind, there's still a couple of minutes to answer a couple of questions that came like after your part. Two people were interested in knowing how difficult it was to leave Cuba after the revolution.
It was difficult. At that time, it was very difficult to leave Cuba, and you were viewed as a traitor to the revolution. I was a small child, so I wouldn't have understood a lot of what was going on. I thought we were just going on a trip. But I know from my parents, from what they've told me, it was very difficult. They only told one of the neighbors. They didn't tell all the neighbors in the building because they thought they would be upset at them or mistreat them in some way. And then at the airport, they also had difficulties. People were strip searched at that time. And then we were finally on the plane, and some officer came rushing on board saying that my father had to get off the plane, but it's because they had him confused with somebody else that they didn't want to leave Cuba. So it was a very difficult time leaving Cuba in that period in the 60s and 70s into really up until the 90s. It was difficult. Things started softening quite a lot, but in that earlier period it was difficult. And there was a time too when, in order to be able to leave Cuba, you had to do some agricultural work, and then they would let you leave the country. So it was very, very difficult. You also had to let your workplace know that you were leaving, and then you lost your job, and you had to wait until your visas and your paperwork and everything came through. So it was a difficult time earlier. Now it's not like that at all. Now people can leave if they want to. That's not restricted. What's more difficult now is entering the United States. That was easier in an earlier time when Cubans were given a lot of help in migrating to the U.S., and there was a whole Cuban package to help Cubans resettle in the United States, and all of that has now ended, because we're living through a period that's very anti-immigrant. So it's just a very, very different time now.
Thank you. And the last one, if you don't mind, is if you recommend any books or website in order to help someone research their own family that spent 2 years in Cuba during World War II.
Oh, wow. Well, I don't have a specific website that I can send them to, but there are some groups on Facebook. There are some Cuban groups on Facebook that might be helpful. And then there's the historian Margalit Bejarano. She has a last name similar to mine, but Bejarano. She might know a little bit more. She's a historian who focuses more on that earlier period. I'm more the anthropologist. So that's what I would suggest. Looking for the sources on Facebook, and looking up the work of Margalit Bejarano.
Great, thank you very much, Ruth. And Sage, this one is for you, and with this we will close for today. Under what type of visa does one extend their trip if with the group?
Oh, if you stay in Cuba longer, we go to Cuba, it'll be under a Cuban tourist visa that the Cuban embassy in DC gets us, and those are good for 3 months. So you can just stay there with that same visa. And then it's a little confusing because the Cuban government sees us coming in as tourists, but the US government says we're definitely not tourists because tourism is not allowed in Cuba under the embargo. So we're going under support for the Cuban people. And then the Cuban government says, you know, we are a system that supports the people. We don't need, you know, that type of, I mean, that tourism is important for them, but it's just a completely like, you know, you get the two governments trying to interpret officially what we're doing there and why we're going in there, and they're very different points of view. So that's why it can be confusing. But same thing under the we will extend your U.S. Treasury license, which will just we give you a letter that is the general license for support for the people with the dates and all the official language on it, and we'll make you one with your date extensions so that you'll have everything official, and then you don't. There's nothing else you'll really have to do except for just let us know what your extra dates are, and we'll take care of the rest.
Great. Thank you very much, Sage. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for staying until the end. We will be in touch tomorrow, and we really hope that you take the step and join this excellent tour. I wish I could join, but not this year. Maybe next time. Thank you very much. See you
Thank
soon.
you.